Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Maclean, and on behalf of John Bartlett and Geelong Regional Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to John's Poetry Book launch this afternoon. I wish to acknowledge the well-run and Eastern Maya original owners of the lands on which these library services operate. We pay respect to elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Before we begin, a little bit of background about myself and then about John. I was a teacher here, a teacher of English here in the UK for most of my life. I came here in 1976. I started writing seriously about 10 years ago. And I really was desperate to be published. I got my creative juices back after a lifetime of teaching. And in that time, I've published 5 chapbooks and 1 full collection. I live in Torquay. I conduct the odd English creative writing workshop. And like many people this year, I've become a bit of a home and garden body. And the writing has hit a bit of a black spot this year, as I think it has for many people. John Bartlett is the author of 3 novels, a collection of short stories, a collection of published non-fiction. He's a reviewer, an interviewer, he's a former tutor of creative writing at Deakin, and a creative writing workshop facilitator. His poetry has been published in a number of Australian and overseas journals. In June 2019, Melbourne Poets Union released his chapbook, The Arms of Men. In 2020, Ginninderra Press published Songs of the God-Forsaken as part of the Picaro Poets series, as well as his full poetry collection, Awake at 3 AM, in late 2020. He was the winner of the 2020 Ada Cambridge Poetry Prize. This is the book that we're launching today, Awake at 3 AM. And I've written about this collection. Loss, longing and nostalgia infuse the poems in this poignant collection. Some poems are elegiac, some confessional, others alert to environmental exploitation, sexuality and human suffering. Here is a poet engaged with his world and showing us what it is to remember, to question, to see and to feel. Congratulations, John. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Just also, normally a launch is somebody standing up and delivering a sort of an essay or a little speech about the collection, but we thought it's John's idea that we have a Q&A instead to launch his book, which I think is a lovely idea. So we're going to have a little chat amongst ourselves for about 20 minutes, and in that time John is going to read about 5 of his poems from the collection. And at the end, there'll be 10 minutes of an open mic, and I'll invite you to ask any questions or make a comment, or read a poem. And there'll be a microphone just up here. I'm being directed now, for anyone who would like to participate. And I'll remind you all just before that to see if anyone would like to participate in that little 10-minute open mic. So if we could just make our phones silent, we can launch the launch. John, I'd like to start by asking you, you've written so much prose over the years in all different genres, so I'm interested in what made you move from prose to poetry.
Julie, I think there was a practical reason in the beginning. I think that when I wrote my first novel, which was sort of fairly much autobiographic about my years in the Philippines, it was sort of fairly straightforward. But when I got to my second novel, which tries to bring together a couple of strands of my own family story, it needed an awful lot of research. It needed an awful lot of planning in terms of how to make the chapters work, how to make the characters believable, get the timelines right. There was a lot of planning and a lot of thinking, a lot of sort of what I'd call left brain work, lots of probably not very intuitive sort of work. And also, it took quite a few years to write. And But then it took quite a few years to try and get published, and didn't get published, and so I had to self-publish. So that was all part of the process. So then I had to try and find ways of promoting it. So I was pretty exhausted by the end of that process, and I thought, I don't think I really want to do this anymore. What will I do? And then I did a poetry workshop in Melbourne with Kevin Brophy, a well-known Melbourne poet. And I started to write little poems. And I found that, I could write a little poem of a few lines, and that was finished, and that was quite satisfying. And then perhaps another little poem after that. So I had the energy to do that, I suppose. And then as that sort of went on, I found that that probably suited my personality more too, because it was more of an intuitive process. It was more of what I sort of call a right brain process. And I'm not quite sure whether the left brain, right brain dichotomy still exists in human psychology, but it does explain for me sort of the two sides of the human activity, that the left brain is that sort of very rational, organised, mathematical side of the brain that we use every day really to function in the world, to go to work, to put out the bins, to pick the kids up from school, all those sort of practical things. But that right side of the brain, which is the more childlike, more playful, more dreamlike, more intuitive side, gets a bit left behind. And for me, poetry was a way of expressing that side, I think, of myself. A much more intuitive process, which took away the pressure, I suppose, of the planning and all that sort of thinking about things. Much more intuitive. And I find that sort of suits me better. I think I'll probably unlikely to go back to long prose again, I think.
You've also got a lot of interest too, John. I mean, your non-fiction was based on environmental issues. You're interested in memoir writing. You're interested in social justice and just being an activist, really, in many ways too. So, can you tell me what do you look for when you're looking for a poem? You're looking around all the time. How do you go about thinking about a poem and writing one?
I think, just to say about the poems of this collection, the latest collection, I should probably say there doesn't seem to be a sort of a chronological sort of connection between writing the poems and getting them published. So these are the most recently published, but a lot of my earlier poems are here, whereas my later poems were in what came out last year, the chapbook Songs of the God-Forsaken, which are my more recent poems, and I think a lot different. So those earlier poems, I think, were really about more obvious things like family memories. Got quite a few things about growing up in South Australia here, about my own family, about sort of the more obvious things of nature, I suppose, things that are a bit more obvious. Whereas the later poems, I think, they've changed in that they're sort of fascinations with words and the way words play together, perhaps. More intuitive things, I think, really. Less obvious, more sort of intuitive.
Well, I've noticed too that you write using different codes of language as well, if I can say that. Different sort of styles of writing as well. Some of your poems are very sparse, very edgy, and some of your poems are very lyrical and quite elaborate and quite sublime in the use of language. So, you employ these different styles of language. So where do you think you get those ideas from? Do you enjoy that sort of playing with different styles of language? Where do you get those sort of influences and ideas to do that?
Good question. There are differences, I think, but it's not intentional. I think it never is intentional, but I have been thinking about early influences, and I think most poets probably think about, what were the things that influenced them from the beginning. And for me, it's sort of fairly clear, because I grew up, in a very religious Catholic family, and I was very exposed to the church, the liturgy of the church, the hymns of the church, very exposed to the Bible readings, and then studying theology, I was exposed to Latin all the time. And in fact, some of our studies were actually Latin textbooks. So Latin had a huge influence on me without me sort of thinking about it. And I think I've seen how it has come into my poetry unbidden, really. It's an influence that's there. But I'm glad of it, really, because I sort of think about, Latinate words and Anglo-Saxon words. There is quite a difference. I know when I was a tutor at Deakin, and we had a subject called something about writing clearly and distinctly. It was all about teaching students to use short sentences, no more than 13 words in a sentence, use short words, don't use passive voice, just use very simple, straightforward words, which is fair enough for, for speak clearly and concisely. You do need that sort of language, but it's not poetic language really. With Latinate words, they're much more complex, they're abstract, they've got sort of lots of different associations, they've got sort of historical associations. They're more complex and they're probably not as easy on the spot to understand straight away, but they're sort of more satisfying, I think, because they leave you with unanswered questions and they connect you to other ideas, and I think in that sense, they fit poetry. I don't think they make for better poetry necessarily, but they certainly make for different poetry, and I'm pleased that I've had that influence on me, I think. But we've sort of talked about influences before, and I think we've got in common. Tennyson was a big influence on both of us. I was very exposed to the Romantic poets, but for some reason or other Tennyson, sort of lingers. And the rhythms of Tennyson, I think, are there. And he's got this sort of trance-like, otherworldly connection all the time, that he's interested in, I think. And that sort of interests me too. Can I just say too about talking about the Bible and the words of the Bible influencing me and the stories of the Bible? If you look at the Bible, the poetry in the Bible is just extraordinary. If you look at things like the Psalms, they're just absolute poetry themselves. If you read the Song of Songs, it's probably one of the most erotic poems ever written, really. It's beautiful, and I find coming into my poetry lines from the Bible, but I like the idea of sort of engaging with them and sort of making something else of them too. It's sort of like having a dialogue, I suppose, and contemporising, some of those ideas and those lines from the Bible, making them into something else. I think that's what poets do. They engage with that whole past, trove of poets and poetry, Tennyson and all the Romantic poets. But you have to sort of do something with it, I think. Wordsworth sort of pretty much said the last word on daffodils. Once you're done with daffodils, you can draw a line under that, really. What you have to do is you've got to say something else about daffodils, I think, really, because as poets we worry about cliches, I think, all the time. We don't want to just say the same things over and over again. We want to find new ways of expressing ideas. But maybe could I read?
I think you should read that lovely Do Not Touch.
Yeah, look, this sort of
that
probably demonstrates what I was trying to say about the use of Latinate words. And this poem's not in the collection. This is something that I wrote more recently during lockdown. I did a lot of poetry writing during lockdown, and the title of this poem is a poem from the New Testament. Some of you may know of Noli Me Tangere, which is the Latin. Which we always understood when we were studying in seminary was, do not touch me. And that was sort of the stricture in the seminary was, no touch. You shouldn't be touching anybody at all. But I found that there's another translation, I think, which is more a Greek translation, which is the idea of cease holding on to me. Now these are the words supposedly that Jesus spoke to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection, after he came out of the tomb. And Mary rushed to touch him because she was so delighted to see him. And he said, cease holding on to me, which I think you'll agree has a totally different meaning. It's that idea of, it's not just don't touch me now, but now's the time to cease holding on to me into the future, because things are different now. I'm a different person and our relationship is different. So I've always been fascinated with that phrase, Noli Me Tangere, probably a bit of a humorous sort of connection because of the seminary days. We used to use that as a bit of a joke, the Noli Me Tangere thing. But I've sort of taken it as a title for this poem, and also to me, I'm trying to reinterpret it in the sense, I was very struck last year, I'm sure as we all were, by early in the pandemic, the numbers of people who die suddenly and unexpectedly, who died alone, and who people weren't able to touch. People died without their relatives being able to touch them. And that seems such a terrible, such a poignant sort of way to die. So this is the poem that I wrote sort of on that line, Noli Me Tangere. Here in the museum of misplaced touch we wait, in sudden excavation from our layered lives. Do not touch this archaeology of flesh, for we are irreplaceables, and in this altered state, pupate. We crystallise, cocoon within our lives of stories. On borrowed air we measure our last breaths, entombed within sarcophagi, while around us tread the acolytes of light, but softly in the ceremony of sacred. Priests in sacerdotal white process us to the chamber of unbearable loss, where we pause, till, snatched, updrafted, we rise, migrate, swarm, a symphony of blue. We are butterflies, confetti in the silver air, where familial arms reach down to touch us, to claim us, to embrace. We abandoned our extravagance of memories on earth, where ghost lights burn, recalling all our thens.
Thanks, John.
Can I just add, without going too much, but I went through this poem and I picked out all the Latinate words. And, I never set out to write Latinate words, but they came up like museum, excavation, archaeology, crystallised, cocoon, entombed, sarcophagi, acolytes, ceremony, sacred, sacerdotal, familial, embrace, extravagance. They're all Latinate words. They're not Anglo-Saxon words. So I think it's sort of a demonstration to me of how those Latinate words have influenced me, and sort of developed a style that I suppose has been called sort of perhaps lavish and ornate, and perhaps Baroque even sometimes. I'm not sure that's a good or bad thing, really, but that explains the style that sort of does suit me.
Yeah, I think it's great to see something, to see work like yours, John, because I think a lot of poets, a lot of writers, we're stuck in this kind of Hemingway, Raymond Carver mode of the short clipped sentence, the Anglo-Saxon short, simple words, and not enjoying that sort of embellishment. And I actually can see it creeping in now. So I think you're a bit of a forerunner, I think you're a bit of a trendsetter here, because I think that's what's happening. And I can see it, which is terrific. But I think I want you to show us your other side too. And after the seriousness of the last year, and that is a kind of a COVID poem as well, that we're all looking for levity, I think. We're looking for something a bit lighter, we're looking for something humorous now because of everything. So, and humour is a bit of a dirty word sometimes too in poetry. You don't often find a prize-winning poem that's funny. So, we always think we must have a dark poem. A dark poem is, that's the winner. It's got to be serious and dark. But could you just talk about how you see humour in poetry, and if there is a place for it, and how and who?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think there's a bit of a fine line between a poet and a stand-up comedian. Comedians are all about playing around with words and ideas and phrases, and I was brought up on the Goons, and the Goons are just full of silly, funny phrases, playing with words, but they're more than that too. There are ideas and everything underneath all that. And, I think if you put a slam poetry reader, standing up and sort of speaking a poem next to a stand-up comedian, they've got loads in common, I think, really. I think it's a difficult thing to write, though. You can't just try and be funny. Is it perhaps an ironic way of sort of seeing the world, which really is what the Goons and Monty Python, they have that sort of ironic sort of side, I think, behind everything, didn't they?
I think they were making fairly serious statements about
Yes.
things, really, the absurdity of situations. And Spike Milligan was a great influence for me as a young child.
Yes.
Just that nonsense poetry, that musicality, just the sounds. But underneath, he was saying some pretty serious stuff about the absurdity of the politics of the time, that kind of thing.
That's right.
Yeah. But we were talking earlier about Billy Collins, who was the poet laureate in the States for a while. He's very funny.
He's hilarious. And people love him, don't they? But I think, as you said, he's never been sort of elevated to the status of...
The Academy doesn't love him because he is amusing, I think. But I think there's serious undertones there as well, but wonderful to read.
Mm. So are there maybe some controls over what's really poetry and what isn't really poetry? Who's pulling the strings and who's making the decisions about what's really poetry?
Look at the trends in poetry now. I think poetry is exploded, really.
Absolutely.
It's a very exciting place now.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think what's happened is that, it was the old dead white males that, ruled the academies when we were growing up, that we learned. And they've been superseded, really. And it seems to me now that, a younger generation really is picking up poetry and running with it, which is just fantastic. And social media has had a lot to do with that. Not only is it possible now to be published in any, you have to sort of write good poetry, but you can submit now to websites all over the world and have your poems published. I think the last number of poems, 10 poems I've had accepted, 5 of them were accepted at overseas websites. And social media has had a huge change, I think. Has permitted poets to be published more widely. I was reading recently there's a thing called Instapoets, which are young poets publishing on Instagram. So the accessibility is there now, and it seems like younger people are picking that up and running with it, and they're not, the poets of the academy that are sort of judged by their seniors as to whether it's good poetry or not. The poetry is getting out there, especially with minority groups. A lot of minority groups now are being published, and even in Australia now we're getting, there's some excellent poets of Muslim background. There's a poet called Sarah M. Soleil, who recently won the Peter Prize Poetry in Australia, which is probably the biggest prize of poetry in Australia, and she's Palestinian background. It's beautiful poetry. So I think that it is changing. I think it's much more exciting and much more interesting, and it just opens the whole thing up, much more, I think. The same gatekeepers, I don't think, have control over poetry anymore, and long may it happen that people get the chance to sort of get their work out there.
I think online poetry had a really bad name initially, it just seemed like everybody was publishing, but now some of the best journals, I think, are online poetry journals. Like our own Cordite is internationally recognised as being a top journal, and it really is. It's it's a showcase of Australian poetry. It's fantastic.
It seems like opportunities for those individual poems are growing more and more, but opportunities for full-scale publications seem to be less and less, I think, even in Australia. I think that's part of the whole change in publishing. Publishing is more expensive, just as we see newspapers folding and losing their support. Book publishers have to work a lot harder now, and poetry is really sort of probably at the bottom of the list of what they're going to sell, so it's more and more difficult. I see a publisher recently who's been publishing a lot of Australian poetry has just announced that they're not accepting any more submissions for the rest of 2021 for any publishing next year. So, immediately there's a loss of opportunity there, I think, too.
Yeah, there are very, very few publishers in Australia now accepting poetry for hard copy.
That's right.
But I think it's going to change to maybe e-books. You've published an e-book, so self-publishing. Self-publishing was a bit of a dirty word as well in publishing arena, but even that's changing now. Initially, you couldn't get reviewed if you self-published, but I think that is going to change. In fact, I think I've seen some reviews of self-published collections, so I wouldn't be put off by that either. And even just publishing your own book online as collections. If you want to get your work out there, I think it's the thing to do. How about reading transition?
Okay.
to show us your edgy side.
Well, I have to say it's probably the only sort of semi-humorous poem in this whole collection I could find, because most of the poems are pretty dark in this collection, and a friend of mine reading it said, I'm a bit worried about you, but I had to explain that some of these are quite old poems, written probably 20 years ago, and I think my style and my attitude has sort of changed since then. But this is one that you say, Julie, is edgy, so I'll bow to your discretion. Happy to go. Transitioning. Some days I'm a drag queen careering on roller skates with fireworks exploding from my hair. Get out of the way! I'm a hand grenade, about to pull the pin. I smoke like a coal-fired power station and I don't give a shit. I wind up windows when I see charity collectors at traffic lights. Nights I sit in dark rooms and shout at the TV. Other days I fold myself up neatly into small boxes. I remember to put out the pins. I draw in straight lines, and I'm polite to phone marketers. I'm just transitioning.
Perhaps we could contrast that with something lyrical. How about reading Last Night?
Okay, Last Light. Just preface by saying that, to say that, poems can need a lot of blood, sweat and tears. There's a lot of work in poems, but just sort of going back to that idea I had of, if you keep your poetic antennae sort of out there in the world, things sort of seem to get attracted somehow, which is just as well, I think, really. Lines can sort of fall on the page without sort of too much trouble. It doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. It's that idea of that intuitive sort of side of the brain sort of being available, I think, sometimes in poetry. So this poem sort of came pretty much sort of straight onto the page. Last light. Light rushes to the west. Clouds lose their bearings. We clutch at last light before night rushes in. A silver artery that dissects the wetlands. Swans fold up their wings reluctantly. Ducks drifting seaward, surrendering to creek swell. Longing stir in the deepest itself. We are the seabirds, snatched by invisible rapture, abandoned to wind's whim, nonchalant in our desires. Nature tolerates no conscience. And that last line, nature tolerates no conscience, I don't really understand that. So I don't know whether it's a rule that you have to understand your own poetry. Someone asked me to explain it once, and I said, couldn't really. So I don't know, do you have to be able to understand what you write all the time?
No, I really love the idea of the stream of consciousness, the stream of consciousness, just writing with nothing on your shoulders, writing, to see what comes out, to see where it takes you, and then pulling a poem out of that. I think that's great. And dreams are a great fodder for poetry as well. Dreams are wonderful things for poems.
Well, some of my youth charade people who are here today will know when we do an exercise, I'm just absolutely fascist in saying, you just don't listen to the judge in your editor in your ear, just write. Don't censor what comes onto the page at the start, because that'll be all the good stuff and you can go back later on and do the censoring. I think even the beat poets in America, that was their catchphrase, wasn't it? Just write.
Just write, the Jack Kerouac, the whole sort of road trip type thing. Just write and write. And see, a lot of that was a sort of bit of blah, really. It could have been edited, I think. But
so where do you sort of make the distinction between the blah and the decent writing?
Well, that's the hard work, isn't it?
Couldn't it be just a cop-out to say, well, this is just my stream of consciousness, so...
Yeah, and they're terrific, great. It's raw, it's real, it's fantastic. It's just Jackson Pollock all over the canvas. Yeah, so that's where the hard work comes in, I think, is deciding what to trim, so getting the left and right brains sort of balanced, so that you cut and trim, so that you feel as though it's saying what you want it to say, I suppose. And sometimes, if it's something you don't really understand, it might come back to you, like years later or months later or something.
So you have to trust that sort of intuition sometimes to just let the line stay.
Yeah, I think so. But I think you should always revisit a poem. Because sometimes I'll write a poem and think, oh, wow, wonderful, it's the best poem that's ever been written. And then the next day I'll look at it and think, my God, what was I thinking? It's just ridiculous. You know, and then I really am a bit embarrassed and, and have to start slashing and burning. But yes, it's a tricky little beast.
Yes.
How about reading, because we're going over time now. And I think we'd like to hear another couple of poems, would we? Yes, before, yeah. And then if anyone has any questions, comments, or would like to read a poem from the collection, you're very welcome to do so. How about reading, what do you feel like reading?
Is it Suburbs? One that you're right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, that's very relevant to us down here, isn't it?
So this poem was actually written on the train ride from Geelong to Melbourne, where poems seem to happen, just as poems seem to come to me on the beach, walking on the beach. I don't know about you, but they come at inopportune times, sometimes, when you haven't got a pencil and a book or to write words down.
No, blank page for me.
Blank page.
For me.
So anyway, this is on the train somewhere around Tarneit, I think. The suburbs. Overnight, the suburbs creep, huddling mushrooms with their grey roofs and sense of entitlement. Rhizomes tunnelling through our dreams and our memories. Across windswept paddocks, plastic bags prance like iced-up free-range chooks. Disemboweled mattresses sprawl, abandoned near railway tracks. Where else? Obscene remnants of trickle-down economics. Developers circle in their purring Lamborghinis like patient birds of prey.
And perhaps we could finish with one last one, do you think?
Okay, this is a poem I like. It's a comfortable sort of poem. I don't know if it's a decent poem or not, but it's called the Noumea Quartet, and it was written in 2008. I think Stephen and I went to New Caledonia for a holiday, and before I went, I knew that it would be a quartet for some reason or other. It's one of those intuitive little things that happen around poetry, and it turned out to be a quartet. 1. The Glittering Pacific. I woke up in the Hotel Beau Rivage, the waves of the glittering Pacific, smaller than I expected. Kanak mothers rinsing babies in the sea like bundles of dirty laundry. We wallowed in the curve of the Baie de Citron. What seemed essential slipped away. SIM cards now irrelevant. My schoolboy French suddenly adequate. The sun on pale skin, the resting tide rippling across stones. You and I together, the universe tilting in our general direction. 2. The women of Noumea. The women of Noumea glide by on clouds of sang-froid, limbs moving like champagne in tall glasses, feet gliding effortlessly like roller skates, hair set free like yachts scudding across the Baie de Citron, faces sculpted from black marble, dredged up from seabeds, a glistening mulier fortis, and oh, how you love your children. 3. Madonna of the Baie de Citron. Outside the Hotel Beau Rivage, she paces out an ancient vigil, muttering self-taught prayers. The bus she waits for will not arrive. She's consecrated to the lights that simmer around the bay, beads on the dangling rosary. I close the curtains on those long night hours, her compassionate companions. Then, at the quiet light of morning, she stands at the water's edge, the flèche bertière, guiding home the souls of departed family. One passing sparrow calls out her name in recognition. 4. Time passes. In Rue Auguste Brun, dusty glass cases hold headdresses eons old, their feathers painting the shaded stillness of a New Caledonia afternoon. Doors spring open, releasing Kanak children with hair like electric spaghetti. Come back after lunch, says the dreadlocked doorman. You don't have time now to see it all. We step back into Rue Egglesbrunn, where time slows to a trickle. Women in flowered dresses chat under lipstick pink bougainvillea. Time, callous and blind, dismisses my small life like a rejected lover.
Very last lines there, John, in that one. You lull us, don't you, into this lovely image of these beautiful children moving around, and then you just...
It's a beautiful memory, yes.
Yeah, but those last lines, they're real killers. Okay, we've only really got 5 minutes, so would anyone like to ask a question, make a comment, read a poem? I'd like to invite you now to step up to the microphone, please. Thank you. We have a lady here, terrific. Thank you very much. Yes, you could just wiggle it around. Just move it down to yourself, just have it. Yeah, that's it.
It's scared this, isn't it? Yes, this is an advertisement. I think it's always time for an advertisement. It's going to be a short advertisement. It's about a little book called A Small Discipline, which is a haiku book, my haiku book, which is in Bellring Collections at the top of Maple Street between Smellies and the Music Den. Please go buy it. I'm not a starving poet, but I could do some cake as wine. Thank you. Take care. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Any more? Okay, I think we'll wind it up there then in that case.
Okay.
And thank you very much, John, and thanks everybody for coming out on this day. And I'd like to thank Geelong Libraries for hosting this important event. And Lynn from Torquay Books is over here, and if anyone would like to buy the collection, you're very, very welcome to go and buy a book, and John will be here to sign. So thank you everybody. We're going to be meeting up at Beeves Bar, which is just up the road here, 2 minutes up the road, for a drink after. If anyone would like to join us, you're very welcome. Thank you all for coming. Oh, do you know what's at Beeves Bar is just, you go out of the library, you just turn left, cross the lights, and then you carry straight on. It's just on the left, about 50 metres up on the left. So it's just in this road. Beeves Bar. It's a retro bar. It's very groovy, very nice. Okay.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody.